the earth shook with the memory of forgotten footsteps. Before kings and cities, before history took its first breath, a different kind of humanity ruled the world. They were the Neanderthals, intelligent, resilient, and deeply human, and the giants, towering hunters whose strength could move mountains. Together they walked through fire and frost, carving their stories into stone, their echoes carried by the wind long after their bodies had turned to dust. Their world was not legend but truth, buried beneath ice and time. Tonight that truth awakens. This is the story of their rise, their fall, and the legacy that still lives within us. So, before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in ancient mysteries, subscribe for more journeys into humanity's forgotten past, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. Let's see how far their memory still travels. Beneath the ancient sky, the world was vast, frozen, and untamed. The continents lay draped in ice, and the air itself carried the weight of ages. Winds swept endlessly across plains of snow and stone, whispering through valleys where mammoths moved like living shadows. The stars burned sharper then, untouched by smoke or memory, casting their pale light upon a planet still half asleep. This was Earth long before the stories, before the rise of kings or the carving of names. It was a world of silence and endurance, where the measure of life was written not in words but in survival. In this immense wilderness, more than one kind of human called the earth home. They did not yet know of history, but they carried its beginnings in their bones. Across the mountains and river plains of Eurasia, the Neanderthals built their shelters from wood and stone. They were not the brutish beings once imagined, but masters of their cold dominion, broad-shouldered, thick-boned, and resourceful. Their hands shaped flint with precision. Their fires burned steady through endless nights. But the Neanderthals were not alone. In the deeper forests and frozen plateaus of the north, another lineage of humankind endured. Taller, stronger, their bones heavy and limbs long, they hunted with a quiet power that seemed almost mythic. To those who would one day uncover their remains, they would be called the giants, people of immense stature and strength, adapted to a world that demanded nothing less. Some were descendants of older bloodlines, perhaps born from the same ancestral stock that once spanned Africa and Europe. Others, their faces lost to time, might have been something entirely different, a branch of humanity that rose and vanished before we ever learned their names. Between them, the earth trembled with the echo of shared life. They followed herds through icy valleys, gathered roots from thawed earth, and watched the same constellations trace slow paths across the heavens. For thousands of years, their worlds overlapped. Fires burned on distant ridges, two kinds of people watching the same horizon, never knowing they would soon become ghosts to one another. The land was both cradle and crucible. Storms carved its memory into stone, glaciers groaned as they advanced, and rivers etched new maps into the frozen soil. Each night, under the eternal sky, the air shimmered with a stillness older than words. Somewhere, in that silence, the first thoughts of meaning took shape, the awe of existence, the rhythm of life and death, the awareness of being small beneath something infinite. Here, before history began, the foundations of our story were laid. The footsteps of Neanderthal and giant pressed side by side into the same mud, their lives bound by hunger, fire, and endurance. Beneath that ancient sky, humanity was still learning what it meant to be alive. Long before written memory, deep within the cold valleys of Europe and Western Asia, another kind of human thrived. They were the Neanderthals, broad-chested, thick-boned, and shaped by ice and endurance. Their bodies told the story of survival, carved not by luxury but by necessity. In the caves of France, Spain, and the Caucasus, they built fires that burned through long winters, their hands steady, their minds sharp. Beneath layers of earth and time, their bones still whisper that they were not creatures of darkness, but children of resilience. The Neanderthals knew the rhythm of the land. They understood the migrations of the bison, the scent of the reindeer on cold air, the fragile pattern of the seasons. Every tool they made bore marks of purpose and intelligence. They chipped stone into blades, hafted spears with sinew and resin, and carried fire as both weapon and warmth. Their communities were small, but their bonds ran deep. Archaeological traces reveal they cared for the wounded, buried their dead, and tended to the old proof that empathy, not cruelty, shaped their world. In the quiet of their caves, flickering firelight danced on walls where pigments of ochre and charcoal marked the beginnings of imagination. The handprints they left are not random, they are signatures of existence, soft declarations that they were here. The air around them shimmered with the birth of art, the first attempts to speak without words. Yet among their memories, older stories were told of beings larger than themselves, travelers from the cold edges of the earth. To later generations, they would become the giants of legend, shadows from an age before language. Perhaps these myths were born from truth. Fossils of colossal bones found near Neanderthal sites hint at other human forms taller, stronger, their skulls massive, their limbs built for endurance. Whether kin or stranger, these beings lived close enough to be remembered. The Neanderthals coexisted with them beneath the same ancient sky. In the stillness of glacial nights, two species of humanity watched the same stars and warmed themselves beside similar flames. Their paths crossed in forests now long vanished, their footprints buried beneath layers of ice and soil. In time, their voices would fade, the winds would erase their tracks, and only bones would remain to tell their story. But they were not forgotten. The myths of giants, of powerful beings lost to the past, are echoes of their memory. The Neanderthals were not the mistakes of evolution, they were the guardians of the world before history, the quiet architects of compassion in an unforgiving age. In the long silence of the Ice Age, when night stretched for months and the cold ruled the land, one small, flickering light stood defiant against the darkness. Fire. For the Neanderthals, it was more than warmth, it was memory, protection, and spirit. Around each hearth, life took shape. The glow of the flames turned cave walls into living canvases, reflecting faces that had learned to think, to imagine, to endure. Every spark struck from flint and pyrite marked a victory over the indifferent world around them. Their mastery of fire was precise and deliberate. Archaeologists have found circles of ash and burnt bone, hearths carefully rebuilt in the same places generation after generation. These were not accidental fires sparked by lightning or luck. They were cultivated and controlled, tended like living companions. In the light of those flames, the Neanderthals cooked their food, hardened their tools, and gathered close to share a warmth that no other creature on earth could command. Fire gave them time to talk, to plan, to dream. It lengthened their nights and deepened their minds. Stone was their other teacher. In their hands, raw rock became extension of will. They shaped flint and quartzite into blades, points, and scrapers with a precision that rivaled the craftsmanship of early Homo sapiens. Each strike of the hammerstone followed patterns of thought, sequences passed through generations. The Mousterian tools they left behind, cleavers, hand axes, and spear tips, were not crude remnants, but the signatures of an intelligent and inventive species. The rhythm of their tool-making echoed the rhythm of survival, patient, skilled, enduring. Evidence from cave sites across Europe reveals that their world was not only practical but symbolic. They gathered minerals not only for tools but for color: red ochre, black manganese, yellow iron oxide. Some was used to stain hides, others to mark bodies or bones. Beneath the soot of millennia, traces of ritual begin to emerge. Burials lined with flowers, bodies arranged with care, and pigments placed beside the dead suggest reverence, perhaps even belief. They looked upon death and gave it form, transforming grief into ceremony. In the firelight, meaning was born. Their gatherings around the hearth were more than survival, they were the first steps toward culture. Songs may have been hummed, stories murmured, gestures shared in the quiet hours before dawn. The world beyond the cave remained vast and merciless, but within those circles of warmth, Neanderthals became more than hunters. They became thinkers, makers, and keepers of memory. As the night deepened, the wind swept across the frozen plains, but within those caves, humanity's first light glowed steady. Fire and stone, the twin gifts that defined their age, taught them how to endure, how to shape the world, and how to remember that even in darkness, the spark of thought could keep the cold at bay. Across the frozen plains of the Old World, long before history had a voice, a new kind of human began to appear. They were immense in form, their shadows long against the snow, their footprints deep in the earth. The Neanderthals, who had long ruled these lands of ice and stone, were not alone. From the heart of colder frontiers, through windswept valleys and glacial passes, came beings whose stature defied the ordinary scale of humankind. Their bones would one day astonish the scientists who unearthed them, thick as clubs, towering in height, built for strength beyond measure. These were the tall ones, the human giants of prehistory. Some say they descended from ancient Homo heidelbergensis, the ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans, though their true lineage is still uncertain. Their skulls were massive, their brows heavy, their limbs forged by survival in a world that demanded nothing less than power. They hunted not merely with skill but with force, driving mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses through the snow, their spears fashioned from entire trunks of ash. In a land where cold could kill in minutes, their bodies were fortresses of endurance. Their presence was first felt in the mountains. Deep within the limestone ridges of what is now Germany and the Balkans, caves once thought empty revealed vast chambers darkened by ancient fires. There, fragments of colossal femurs and jawbones spoke of people far larger than those who came before. They were not myths or monsters, but another expression of what humanity could be: adapted, immense, enduring. The tall ones moved through the landscape like migrating storms. From the Caucasus to the Atlantic plains, they left faint echoes of their passing stone tools large enough to fill both hands. Shelters built into the sides of cliffs, bones split cleanly for marrow. The Neanderthals must have seen them from afar, perhaps with awe, perhaps with fear, recognizing in them something familiar yet foreign. The earth itself seemed to shift beneath their shared presence. In the rhythm of glaciers and the silence between hunts, these giants became part of the human chorus that once filled the Ice Age world. The land held room for many kinds of humans, then some small and delicate, others vast and formidable. Each adapted in their own way to the cruelty and beauty of the time. The wind that swept through their valleys carried the smoke of their fires, blending with the scent of pine and blood. Their hearts beat the same as ours once did, though their bodies were built on a grander scale. And though their names are lost to time, the stones remember, the bones remember. The land still carries the weight of their passing. The world was wrapped in mist. Dawn rose pale and slow across the Ice Age plains, blurring the horizon where forest met snow. In that half-light, two kinds of humans watched one another for the first time. The Neanderthals, smaller but broad and powerful, stood hidden among the rocks, their breath steaming in the cold. Across the clearing, through drifting fog, moved figures larger than any they had ever seen, towering forms, shoulders wide as boulders, steps deep and deliberate. The giants had arrived, and in that still moment between predator and kin, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. They were not strangers of mind, only of form. Both carried the marks of intelligence, the way they moved with caution, the way their heads turned to listen, the way their hands held tools as extensions of thought. In the faint light of a dying fire, reflection met reflection. Two species born of the same ancient roots, shaped by different trials, now found themselves standing within each other's shadow. The Neanderthals were familiar with dominance and danger, but this was neither. There was curiosity here, a shared recognition in the tilt of the head, in the stillness of waiting. The giants had the height of trees, yet their gestures were measured, almost careful. They moved as if aware of the fragility of the encounter, as if they, too, understood that what stood before them was not beast or rival, but mirror. Fire became their first language. From across the valley, flames flickered on both sides, small at first, then steady, each group tending its hearth as the mist thickened between them. The light shimmered on ice and snow, reflected in the eyes of beings who would never speak the same tongue, but shared the same need to keep the cold at bay. In that shared glow, the silence between them grew softer, filled not with fear but with understanding. Archaeological traces tell of overlapping settlements and hunting grounds where both species thrived. In caves only miles apart, bones of giants and Neanderthals mingle, marked by similar tools and fires built in the same manner. Whether they exchanged gifts or gestures, no one can say, but the patterns of habitation suggest coexistence rather than conquest. For a time, they shared the same world in fragile balance. The mist that morning was more than weather, it was the veil of beginnings. In its folds, two branches of humanity touched for the first time, if only through gaze and distance. When the fog lifted, the giants retreated into the mountains, and the Neanderthals returned to their valleys. Yet something had changed. Beneath that pale sky, kinship had been recognized, and for a brief heartbeat in the long story of time, the earth held two kinds of humans who understood one another without words. Their world was a realm of endurance, sculpted by wind, ice, and time. The homeland of the giants stretched far beyond the familiar territories of the Neanderthals, into the high plateaus and frozen basins where winter never truly ended. Here, mountains rose like the bones of the earth itself, their peaks carved by glaciers that had moved for centuries, grinding stone into powder. Rivers, fed by melting ice, cut deep canyons through the land, their waters cold and metallic, carrying fragments of rock and bone toward distant seas. It was a world of silence, broken only by the cracking of ice and the rumble of herds moving across the tundra. The giants lived where few others could. Their immense bodies were forged for this environment, broad chests that drew in thin, frozen air, thick limbs that carried them through waist-deep snow, and hands strong enough to split bone. They were not clumsy beings of myth, but precise and deliberate hunters. The cold shaped them as the wind shapes stone. In this harsh domain, strength was not merely advantage but necessity. Archaeological traces from the northern valleys tell their story in fragments. Enormous stone tools, far too large for ordinary human hands, lie buried beneath layers of permafrost. Spears made from mammoth bone, their tips hardened by fire, hint at hunters who faced creatures of colossal size. Their shelters, when found, are built into the windbreaks of cliffs and caves, entrances darkened by centuries of smoke. In these places, the air still carries the faint scent of soot and survival. The giants followed the rhythms of the ice. When the herds of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros moved, they followed. When storms buried the plains, they retreated into the caverns of their homeland, waiting for the wind to ease. Theirs was a life measured in migration and memory, each season demanding endurance that would have broken lesser beings. They knew the patterns of the reindeer trails, the way the aurora shimmered before a thaw, the taste of snow that promised spring. In the glow of their fires, mammoth hides dried on frames of bone, and tools rested where they had been laid after long hunts. Around them, the frozen world seemed both enemy and teacher. Every scar on their hands was a lesson in patience, every hunt a test of power against the unyielding will of nature. To stand in the land they ruled was to feel small. The vastness of it, the sound of the wind sweeping across empty plateaus, the cold light that lingered on the mountains. It was a place designed for beings larger than memory. The giants did not merely survive there. They belonged to it. Their homeland was not conquered or tamed. It was endured. And in that endurance, they became one with the frozen breath of the world itself. The earth remembers in silence. Beneath layers of soil and stone, long after voices have faded and fires gone cold, the bones remain. They are the language of time itself, a vocabulary written in calcium and dust. Every fragment, every ridge and joint, is a word in a story older than civilization. When archaeologists kneel beside these remnants, brushing away the centuries, they are not merely uncovering fossils. They are listening to echoes of footsteps, to breath that once warmed the air, to lives that shaped the very ground beneath us. The world of the Neanderthals and the giants speaks most clearly through what was left behind. In caves across Europe and the high plateaus of Asia, bones lie in quiet order, undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. Some bear the marks of stone blades, a record of hunts or rituals. Others show the faint trace of paint, a whisper of color applied by hands that understood beauty. The arrangement of skeletons in these ancient chambers tells of meaning beyond survival. A femur placed carefully beside a skull, a child's tooth tucked into sediment, an animal bone polished smooth. These are gestures of remembrance, not accident. Footprints press the same message into the earth. In the Laetoli of Africa, in the clay paths of Italy and Spain, and deep in forgotten valleys of the Caucasus, tracks frozen in ancient mud tell of beings walking side by side. Some prints are wide and deep, made by giants whose steps span twice the distance of others. Nearby, smaller impressions reveal the presence of Neanderthals or their kin. These silent trails, hardened by time, are the most intimate of records. They capture not only movement but coexistence, the passing of different humans across the same moment in prehistory. And then, there is the art. In the still chambers of caves like Chauvet and El Castillo, where no light has touched the walls for millennia, pigments bloom like memories. Red ochre, charcoal, and manganese trace the outlines of animals, spirals, and human hands. Some belong to Neanderthals, others perhaps to their towering cousins. To press a hand against stone and leave its mark was an act of defiance against extinction, a statement that said, "We were here." Each fossil, each footprint, each painting is part of a conversation that continues long after the speakers are gone. The bones do not speak in words, but their silence is eloquent. They tell of strength and tenderness, of shared worlds and vanished kin. When the wind moves across the caves and valleys where they once lived, it carries a faint murmur, the ancient language of bones, still whispering the story of those who walked before us. In the deep silence of the Ice Age world, when firelight flickered against the walls of caves and the wind howled beyond the stone, something profound occurred. Two branches of humanity, separated by evolution but joined by need, began to share more than the earth beneath their feet. The Neanderthals, resilient and deliberate, met the towering giants who roamed the high plateaus. In their shared struggle against the endless cold, their paths did not merely cross, they intertwined. Beneath firs and over the glow of fires, bloodlines began to merge, and through that union, a new kind of human quietly emerged. The evidence lies not in myth but in marrow. Hidden deep within the code of ancient bones, scientists have found traces of this meeting written in DNA. The genes of Neanderthals still ripple faintly in the blood of modern humans, and though the giants remain more elusive, their influence lingers like a shadow behind the tapestry of our ancestry. Each generation carried fragments of those unions forward, blending strength, adaptation, and memory. It was not conquest that united them, but survival. In a world ruled by cold and scarcity, companionship was life itself. The caves that sheltered them became silent witnesses to this merging. Excavations in ancient European valleys reveal remains that do not belong entirely to one kind of human or another. Skulls with the broad brows of Neanderthals, yet taller frames and lighter builds than their kin. Teeth slightly different in shape, hands that hint at both power and precision. These were the children of two worlds, born in seasons when snow fell early and lingered too long. It is easy to imagine that their meeting began with curiosity rather than fear. Both species shared fire, language of gesture, and the instinct to nurture. The long winters demanded closeness, and the warmth of survival blurred the lines between difference and familiarity. Over time, generations carried blended traits, minds sharpened by Neanderthal patience, bodies fortified by giant strength. What began as fragile coexistence evolved into lineage. The legacy of these unions reached far beyond their lifetime. Through them, new combinations of endurance and intelligence spread across the continent. Adaptations in immunity, bone density, and cognition carried forward through bloodlines that would one day shape the future of humankind. They did not know they were creating history. They simply lived, loved, and endured as the snow fell outside their shelters and the fire burned low. The mingling of their blood was like the meeting of two suns, one ancient and enduring, the other fierce and new. For a brief moment in time, they burned together, illuminating the dark corners of prehistory, and though both would fade, their light continued to echo within us, a quiet reminder that humanity itself was born not from isolation, but from union. Across the endless whiteness of the Ice Age world, the snowfield stretched like a frozen sea. The wind rolled low across the plains, carrying with it the scent of musk and frost. In the distance, shadows moved massive, slow, deliberate. A herd of mammoths, their woolly coats glistening with frost, trudged through the silence, unaware that they were being watched. This was the stage of the Great Hunt, where two species of humanity, the Neanderthals and the giants, worked in fragile harmony against a shared challenge that towered above them both. The mammoth was the heartbeat of that age. It gave food, bone, sinew, and warmth, yet to bring one down required strategy, courage, and cooperation. The Neanderthals had long studied the herds, their movements and moods, the shifting of wind that could betray a hunter's scent. The giants, larger and more powerful, brought force that could move boulders and break ice. Together, they formed an alliance born of necessity, not dominance. Their survival depended on it. In the frozen valleys, traces of their collaboration still lie buried. Large hunting pits carved into permafrost, piles of sharpened spears built for thrusting rather than throwing, and the remains of butchered mammoths arranged with methodical precision. These are the signatures of coordinated minds. It was not chaos that brought down such colossal prey, but planning. The giants drove the herds from the high ground, their size and strength enough to stir panic in the slow-moving beasts. Below, wading along narrow passes and snow-hidden ridges, the Neanderthals lay in ambush. They struck when the moment arrived, targeting the weakest, driving spears through thick hide and into the soft underbelly. The air would have filled with the sound of the hunt, the thunder of hooves, the breaking of ice, the echo of shouted signals that needed no words. They had learned one another's rhythms. The Neanderthals' sharp minds read the flow of the herd, while the giants' immense bodies carried out the push. In those moments, instinct merged with intelligence, and for a brief flicker in time, the two species acted as one. When the hunt ended, the valley fell silent again. Fires burned low in the snowdrifts, the smoke trailing upward into the pale sky. Around the fallen mammoth, tools were raised, bones cracked, meat divided. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of the creature became life, its fat for fuel, its sinew for rope, its ivory for tools and ornament. The giants and the Neanderthals shared the bounty side by side, their faces lit by the same flames, their breath mingling in the cold. This cooperation was more than survival, it was communion. It revealed thought, communication, and trust that transcended language. Archaeologists who later uncovered these sites found proof of intelligence not in the tools alone but in the pattern of their use. The coordination required to execute such hunts speaks to minds capable of strategy and empathy. These were not mere beasts of instinct. They were thinkers, builders of community, capable of unity even across the boundaries of species. As the night settled across the snowfields, the wind carried the smell of smoke and blood far into the frozen plains. For that brief era, the world knew a rare moment of balance. Under the vast cold sky, two kinds of humans stood together, their survival bound by courage and cooperation. And though their fires would one day vanish, their legacy remained imprinted in the bones and stones of the earth, a testament to the first great alliance forged in the heart of the Ice Age. The earth began to tighten its grip. Seasons that once promised thaw and renewal grew shorter, and the snow no longer melted as it once did. A long winter began to spread its wings across the northern world, a cold so deep it reshaped life itself. The sun hung lower in the sky, its warmth feeble and pale, and the once green valleys where herds roamed turned into endless plains of ice. It was an age when the world seemed to hold its breath, when even the rivers slowed, and both Neanderthals and giants found themselves tested beyond measure. This was the winter that never ended. The air carried a sharpness that cut to the bone. The herds of mammoths and bison that once thundered across the tundra began to vanish, their trails buried under layers of snow too deep to cross. The forests thinned, trees cracking under the weight of ice, and the silence grew so vast that even the cry of a bird became a memory. For both species of humankind, survival was no longer a rhythm of life, it was a daily act of endurance. The giants, whose strength had once made them rulers of the plateaus, began to struggle. Their massive bodies, built for power and movement, now demanded more food than the frozen land could offer. The same strength that had been their gift became a burden. Trapped by scarcity, they followed the herds deeper into unknown lands, their migrations etched into the snow like fading footprints. Behind them, they left the bones of their dead, frozen in postures of exhaustion and hunger. The wind swept over their remains, burying them beneath white dunes until the earth itself forgot where they had fallen. The Neanderthals endured in smaller numbers. Their bodies, compact and resilient, conserved heat better. But even their resourcefulness had limits. They sought shelter in the caves that once echoed with laughter and song, now filled with the crackle of dying fires. Food grew scarce, and the hunters returned from their journeys empty-handed, their tools worn from scraping frozen bone rather than fresh meat. The bonds of community kept them alive longer than strength did, but the cost was great. Entire clans disappeared, their dwellings left silent, their names lost to frost and time. Across the continent, glaciers crept forward like slow-moving beasts, grinding stone and forest into dust. The climate shifted with brutal patience, reshaping mountains, rivers, and the fate of everything that walked upon them. Migration became the only answer. The giants moved south in search of warmth, some never returning. The Neanderthals followed the valleys where the ice receded, clinging to pockets of refuge where the ground still yielded roots and the sun still broke through the clouds. Each step became a negotiation with the earth, a promise of endurance against the indifferent cold. Archaeological evidence tells the quiet aftermath of that age. Layers of ash and charcoal mark the final hearths of once thriving bands. Bones of children and elders lie in shallow earth, surrounded by tools worn smooth from years of use. Even in these final traces, there is dignity. The Neanderthals and the giants did not vanish with violence, but with silence. They faced the world as they always had, with courage and unity, until the cold claimed what even strength and fire could not preserve. The winter that never ended did not simply freeze the land, it erased the boundaries between survival and extinction. When the last of their fires dimmed, the snow fell gently upon their shelters, sealing them into the memory of the earth. Beneath that endless white, their story slept, waiting for the day when warmth and time would uncover the truth of those who endured until the world itself grew too cold to remember their names. Deep within the earth, beneath layers of stone and silence, humanity learned to remember. The caves became more than shelter. They became sanctuaries of memory, places where the living spoke to the unseen. In the flicker of firelight, shadows moved across the walls. And within those shadows, something extraordinary was born. Thought became symbol, gesture became art, and both Neanderthals and the giants began to leave their mark upon eternity. In these chambers of darkness, far from the killing wind of the surface, the world softened. The hum of survival gave way to reflection. Across Europe and Western Asia, traces remain. Red ochre, manganese, and charcoal, pressed into the walls by ancient hands. The shapes are simple yet profound: circles, lines, spirals, and the unmistakable outline of a palm. Each print is a statement of existence, a declaration that they were here, that they had lived and felt and longed for meaning. The hand stencils of El Castillo and Maltravieso, though often attributed to early humans, bear dimensions that hint at other makers. Some hands are larger than any modern humans, their span immense. Perhaps they belong to the giants, or to their children, hybrids of two worlds who sought to etch their being into stone before time erased them. These markings were more than art. They were conversation. Each layer of pigment and carving added another sentence to a language unspoken yet universally understood. The Neanderthals carved animal forms into the rock: mammoths, bison, and cave lions, creatures they depended on and feared. The giants, with their immense hands and deep sense of rhythm, may have shaped the more abstract forms, spirals, and patterns resembling the turning of stars. Together, they began to transform their surroundings into mirrors of thought, reflections of themselves cast into the darkness. In the depths of these caves, The first traces of ritual appear. Burials lined with red ochre suggest reverence for the dead. Bones arranged deliberately. Skulls turned toward the entrance, as though facing the light. In one cave, fragments of giant bones rest beside those of smaller humans, a silent testament to a shared existence even in death. Such gestures reveal more than instinct, they speak of awareness, of an understanding that life could end but memory could remain. Archaeologists have uncovered necklaces made of animal teeth, shells, and ivory beads left near burial sites. These were not decorations of vanity but symbols of identity and connection. The act of creating beauty amid hardship was a defiance against oblivion. It was the beginning of something unmistakably human, the need to be remembered. The caves preserved more than bones and pigment. They held emotion, the echo of a footstep, the warmth of smoke rising toward the ceiling, the breath of a child tracing their hand beside that of a parent. These details remain unseen but deeply felt, suspended in the air of every chamber. When we stand before these ancient walls today, we are not merely looking at art. We are looking into mirrors polished by time. The handprints belong to those who refused to vanish quietly. They spoke to the future in the only language they knew, stone and color, gesture and fire. In those caves of memory, beneath the hum of the earth, the Neanderthals and the giants reached across extinction itself, leaving behind proof that thought, once awakened, will always seek a way to endure. In the half-lit silence of ancient caves, long after the fires had burned out, something strange remained. Skulls arranged in deliberate patterns, bones marked with pigment, and traces of ochre spread like soft stains across the floor. These were not remnants of decay, they were signs of intention. The Neanderthals and the giants who shared their world were no longer content merely to live and die. They had begun to speak to something beyond life itself, to honor what they could no longer see or touch. This was the dawn of spirituality, the moment when the human mind first turned inward and asked why. The skulls, when uncovered tens of thousands of years later, seemed to whisper. They told of hands that had lifted them carefully, of rituals performed in the flickering glow of torches. Some were grouped in circles, others stacked with symmetry that spoke of understanding, of reverence. In certain sites, the skulls of animals and humans rested side by side, painted with the same ochre and decorated with the same care. Perhaps these ancient people saw no divide between themselves and the creatures they hunted. To them, all life shared the same rhythm. And death was not an ending but a transformation. Archaeological evidence from the caves of Shanidar, Krapina, and La Ferraci reveals burials filled with red ochre dust, flowers, and tools. The pigment, ground from iron-rich stone, was more than decoration. It symbolized renewal, the color of blood and rebirth. Even in death, they sought to preserve vitality, to carry something of the living into the stillness beyond. These gestures mark the first glimmers of belief, the idea that the world did not stop at the edge of breath. Among the giants, too, traces of ritual appear. Massive skulls found near hearths show cut marks, not of violence, but of careful cleaning, as if the bones themselves were being prepared for ceremony. Some rest atop flat stones, their hollows filled with charcoal and ash, perhaps remnants of offerings. It is possible that these early humans gathered to honor their dead, to speak to them, to keep their presence alive in memory. The arrangement of bones was not random, it followed a pattern, a language of faith expressed through matter instead of words. And then there is the question of speech itself. The anatomy of Neanderthal throats and skulls reveals that they possessed the physical ability to speak, to form complex sounds. The giants, with their broad chests and deep lungs, may have had even greater vocal strength. Imagine their voices rising in unison in a cold valley, echoing through the mountains, primitive chants that bound the living to the dead. These sounds would become the first prayers, the earliest attempts to reach beyond the limits of flesh and time. In this age before gods, faith did not live in temples but in gestures. A hand brushing pigment across a skull, a flower laid beside the fallen, a circle of bones beneath a painted ceiling, each act was a message sent into eternity. The skulls that rest in the soil today are not relics of savagery but monuments of awakening. They mark the moment when thought met mystery, when two species looked at death and chose to give it meaning. The whispering skulls remind us that the line between biology and belief was first drawn in caves beneath the weight of earth and time. Their silent arrangement still speaks, telling us that long before history began, humans had already found their first voice, not in words, but in reverence. Night fell softly over the ancient plains. The sky, free of smoke and city light, opened like a vast mirror, reflecting eternity. Stars shimmered with a clarity no modern eye will ever see again. Beneath them, firelight flickered within circles of stone, and for a brief moment in the long struggle of survival, peace returned to the earth. Neanderthals and the giants, bound by cold and hunger, gathered not as rivals but as kin beneath the same celestial canopy. Theirs was a quiet communion, unspoken but understood, a fragile harmony born of endurance. The fire circle was the heart of their world. Flames rose steady, their light touching faces that had seen both hardship and wonder. Sparks drifted into the night air, vanishing into the black, as if becoming new stars. Around each blaze, tools lay scattered: flint blades, mammoth-bone hammers, antler-tipped spears. Objects passed between hands that no longer belonged to one people alone. The Neanderthals, precise and deliberate, shaped tools with skill and patience. The giants, with their immense strength and sure movements, gave those creations power and reach. Together they learned from one another, trading craft and knowledge the way wind trades heat with the cold. The earth around these camps still bears traces of their fellowship. Hearths preserved in ash tell of repeated gatherings, of fires rekindled in the same places for generations. Fragments of pigment hint that art was shared, that one taught the other how to grind color from stone, how to mix it with fat and ash to make it last. Even the discarded bones of their meals speak of cooperation. Each group taking different tasks, some carving, some preserving, none wasting what life had given them. The night sky above those camps must have felt eternal. Without words, they likely gestured to the constellations, tracing the same patterns that we still recognize. To them, the stars were not distant suns but living eyes, watching over their fragile lives. It is easy to imagine them falling silent together as the aurora shimmered across the horizon, the wind carrying a rhythm that sounded like breath against the flames. That rhythm became part of them, woven into the pulse of their gatherings. In that glow, the line between Neanderthal and giant blurred. Shared warmth softened fear, and survival gave way to reflection. There were moments when the future of humanity sat quietly in those circles, in the exchange of glances, the passing of a tool, the small laughter that rose from relief after the hunt. The world outside remained harsh and indifferent, yet within those circles of fire, something vast was awakening, a sense of belonging, not just to tribe or blood, but to the earth itself. When the last embers cooled, the memory of these gatherings settled into the ground. Millennia later, when the caves were excavated and the layers of ash uncovered, archaeologists found not conflict, but coexistence. The story told by the fire circles was simple yet profound, that even in an age ruled by ice and struggle, there were nights when humanity paused to share warmth, wisdom, and wonder beneath the same stars. And in that pause, civilization took its first quiet breath. The great steppe stretched endlessly beneath a sky of pale gray, a land that once promised abundance but now whispered of loss. The herds that had thundered across the plains were fewer, their trails scattered and faint. The rivers, once fat with meltwater, now crawled beneath crusts of ice. The grass no longer swayed in wide green waves, but lay brittle and patchy, a carpet of frost and silence. The age of plenty was ending, and with it, the fragile peace that had once bound Neanderthal and giant together began to tremble. For generations, these two peoples had shared the frozen world in balance, each hunting, building, and surviving within their own rhythm. But balance is fragile in a climate ruled by cold and scarcity. As the winters lengthened and prey grew elusive, the first shadow of competition crept across the steppe. No longer did the hunters find herds waiting beyond the ridges. No longer did the mammoth trails lead to safety and food. Each dawn carried uncertainty, and hunger became a sharper teacher than memory. Archaeological layers from this period tell the quiet story of rising tension. Stone tools once found side by side now appear separately, scattered across territories divided by unseen borders. Caves once shared or settled in proximity grew distant, their fires no longer overlapping. The bones of hunted animals became smaller, evidence of overhunting and dwindling resources. It was not war in the way history would later understand it, but it was something older and colder, a slow, grinding conflict born of desperation. The giants, vast and powerful, required more food to sustain their heavy frames. Their strength, once a blessing, became a burden in times of famine. The Neanderthals, smaller but more adaptable, learned to stretch what the land could give, trapping, scavenging, and foraging when hunting failed. Yet even their ingenuity could not fill the growing void. When a herd was spotted, both groups followed. The steppe became a chessboard of survival, where every move carried risk, every victory left another hungry. The wind carried the echoes of their struggle. Across the open plains, tracks of pursuit intertwined giant and Neanderthal footprints mingling in the snow, some leading toward the same prey, others away from one another. Skirmishes may have begun at the edges of these hunts, not out of hatred, but necessity. A kill meant warmth, nourishment, life. To lose it meant death. It is within this crucible of scarcity that the first fractures of coexistence appeared. Evidence of wounds on ancient skeletons healed fractures, embedded stone points hints at conflict between their kind. The patterns are not random, they speak of close encounters, of hands that once cooperated now raised in defense. The earth began to absorb the memory of those struggles. The peace that had once glowed around their shared fires dimmed, replaced by a cold light of caution. Yet beneath that shadow, there remained something deeply human. Even as fear hardened their resolve, they recognized the same intelligence in one another's eyes. The tension that grew between them was not born of malice, but of the ancient truth that survival has no favorites. The world they had once shared was changing faster than any could adapt. The glaciers crept closer, the herds moved farther south, and the once living steppe began to fade into a frozen plain of silence. By the time the stars rose over the ice once more, the fires that had burned together now burned apart. The wind that once carried the songs of shared triumph now moved through empty valleys, whispering of what was lost. The shadow over the steppe was not just the coming of cold, it was the passing of an age, when two kinds of humanity stood together, and then, slowly, began to drift into separation. The world began to shake. The air thickened with ash, and the horizon darkened to a color that no dawn could break. Across the continents, the ground split and groaned, releasing a fury buried since the birth of the earth. Volcanoes erupted in violent succession, blotting out the sun and turning day into twilight. The sky rained soot and fire, and a bitter chill swept through the world that had already been struggling to breathe beneath its own weight of ice. This was a time when the planet itself became a force of extinction, when the land convulsed and the balance of life faltered. For the Neanderthals and the giants who roamed the northern plains, the catastrophe was not sudden but suffocating. The ash clouds drifted for months, sometimes years, dimming the light that sustained the fragile tundra ecosystem. Plants withered, rivers filled with sediment. Herds of mammoth and bison wandered aimlessly, their food gone, their migrations broken. The wind carried not the scent of life but the sting of sulfur and decay. Temperatures plunged. Even the giants, whose immense bodies had weathered the worst of winters, felt the weight of hunger and exhaustion pressing closer. In layers of ancient soil, the signature of this destruction remains. Beneath Europe's ash beds lies a record of what scientists now call a volcanic winter, an event powerful enough to change the course of species. Thick deposits of glassy ash trace back to a single eruption from Mount Toba, whose plume circled the earth. The sun dimmed, global temperatures fell, and entire regions froze in a silence that would last centuries. What had been harsh before became unbearable. The glaciers advanced once more, creeping like slow-moving walls of white stone. They swallowed valleys, crushed forests, and redirected rivers. Lands that had once offered refuge disappeared beneath tons of ice. For both the Neanderthals and the giants, survival now meant retreat into caves, into mountains, into the narrowing pockets of warmth left between the encroaching glaciers. They followed the fading herds, living off what the cold had not yet claimed. The environment reshaped them in ways no weapon could. Bones from this era show signs of malnutrition, stress, and disease. Tooth enamel records years of famine, marked by lines of halted growth. Yet even in the face of collapse, traces of ingenuity remained. Fire pits multiplied in the caves, perhaps an attempt to fight the deepening cold. Tools grew more refined, their edges sharper, their construction more efficient. The instinct to adapt persisted, even as the world itself seemed determined to erase them. For the giants, this age of upheaval marked the beginning of their end. Their strength, once unmatched, could not overcome the slow starvation that followed. Fewer of their bones appear in the record after the great eruptions, suggesting their numbers dwindled as the landscape they had mastered turned against them. The Neanderthals endured a little longer, shielded by their smaller numbers and adaptability, but even they were fading. When the ground finally stilled and the ash settled, the world that emerged was colder, emptier, quieter. The echoes of the giants' voices and the footsteps of the Neanderthals had grown faint, their trails erased by the shifting ice. Yet the earth remembered. Every layer of sediment, every buried cave, every bone beneath the frozen soil still carries the memory of that trembling age when fire and ice conspired to silence the old world, and humanity's oldest kin stood upon the edge of disappearance. The wind screamed across the frozen plains, carrying snow that fell not as flakes but as shards of glass. The sky hung low and heavy, swollen with the color of iron. Beneath it, two groups of humans moved in unison for what would be the final time. The Neanderthals and the giants, battered by years of hunger and loss, gathered once more upon the endless steppe. The herds had vanished, the forests had retreated, and the rivers had turned to chains of ice. Yet somewhere beyond the horizon, a last remnant of life stirred a small band of mammoths wandering through the storm. It would be their final chance, and perhaps their last act as a united kind. The evidence of this age lies deep beneath layers of frozen soil, where scattered remains tell of one last monumental hunt. Giant spearheads chipped from volcanic stone, tools forged from mammoth bone, and the fractured remains of great beasts are found together in a single horizon of time. The patterns of butchery, the angles of the wounds, and the positioning of the bones speak of coordination, an organized effort, shared between two species that had once hunted as brothers of necessity. It is easy to imagine what the land must have been like. The wind howled across the tundra, flattening the snow into glittering plains that stretched toward a darkening sky. The mammoths moved in a slow, mournful procession, their massive shapes fading in and out of the storm. Behind them came the hunters, their breath freezing in the air, their steps deliberate and silent. The giants advanced first, their enormous bodies cutting through the drifts, driving the herd toward the cliffs, where escape would be impossible. The Neanderthals followed, smaller and quicker, moving with precision, their tools ready. For a brief, vanishing moment, they worked as one, bound by the shared rhythm of pursuit and survival. When the hunt began, it was not a battle of triumph but of desperation. The storm swallowed sound and light, and in its chaos, human voices mingled with the cries of the hunted. Spears found their mark, and the great beasts fell. The earth shook as they hit the ground, echoing through the valley like thunder. The hunters did not celebrate. They knew the cost. The energy spent in that moment would be difficult to recover. Yet for a time, there was food, warmth, and life. For a time, the old alliance held, as firelight flickered against the carcasses of the fallen mammoths. Archaeologists who study these sites speak of them as the final echoes of cooperation. The Neanderthals' craftsmanship and the giants' sheer strength combined one last time in defiance of extinction. Around the remains of these mammoths lie hearths blackened with soot, bones cracked for marrow, and the faint traces of pigment on stone, perhaps marking gratitude, perhaps mourning. When the storm passed, what remained was silence, broken only by the creaking of ice. After that winter, their trails diverged. The giants faded first, swallowed by the same cold they had once conquered. The Neanderthals lingered for a few thousand more years, surviving in the caves and valleys left untouched by ice. But this hunt, this final gathering under a storm-ridden sky, marked the last time two branches of humanity faced the world together. When the snow settled and the wind calmed, the bodies of the hunters and the hunted lay beneath the same white shroud. The world had moved on, indifferent to their courage, their unity, their fire. Yet somewhere within the bones buried beneath that frozen plain lies the story of their final stand, a moment when, for the last time, humanity stood shoulder to shoulder against extinction, and for a heartbeat, fire burned bright against the storm. When the ice began to retreat, the world softened. The frozen earth that had once been hard as stone turned to mud beneath the first hesitant warmth of spring. Across the valleys and riverbeds, the snow melted into silver pools that reflected a quieter sky. In that silence, footprints appeared, marks left by beings who would soon vanish forever. Some pressed deep into the thawing ground, broad and heavy, belonging to the giants whose strength had shaped the northern plains. Others were smaller, more deliberate, made by Neanderthals who still lingered in the shadows of mountains and caves. Together, they traced the last steps of two kinds of humanity, fading even as the land began to heal. Footprints are among the most fragile of relics. They capture only a moment, a heartbeat of movement suspended in time. Yet within that fleeting impression lies everything: the weight of a body, the direction of its gaze, the story of a journey that will never be walked again. In places where ice once ruled, archaeologists have found such traces pressed into ancient mud and preserved beneath layers of sediment. Some tracks lead toward water, others toward open plains, and a few simply stop, as if the walker had turned to look back one final time before the world moved on without them. The giants disappeared first. Their prints, vast and sure, end abruptly in the fossil record. The reasons were many: hunger, climate, isolation, but their absence felt like the closing of a chapter written in muscle and bone. Their towering presence, once a symbol of endurance, could no longer withstand the slow rhythm of change. The Neanderthals followed soon after. They withdrew into smaller territories, surviving in dwindling numbers until their fires went out one by one. When the last of their footsteps filled with water and dried beneath the sun, an entire lineage of humanity slipped into silence. Nature, indifferent and unhurried, erased them gently. Rain fell, washing the valleys clean. The wind carried dust that settled over the ancient trails. Seasons turned, burying the last signs of their existence beneath layers of soil and time. Yet beneath those layers, the earth remembered. In deep riverbeds and cave floors, those footprints hardened into stone, waiting for someone to find them. When uncovered millennia later, they would tell a story without words, a story of movement, of life, and of loss. Standing before those fossilized tracks today, it is impossible not to feel a kind of quiet awe. Each print is a whisper from the past, a message from hands and feet that shaped the dawn of humanity. They remind us that extinction is not an event but a fading, a slow retreat into memory. The Neanderthals and the giants did not vanish in a single moment. They dissolved into time, their echoes carried forward in our blood, their legacy imprinted in the ground we walk upon. The thawing mud of that ancient world captured more than footprints. It captured the final rhythm of beings who had stood against ice and fire, who had sung to the stars and carved their dreams into stone. And though the wind and rain may have washed their trails away, the story remains. Every step we take now, every path we follow, is traced upon the same earth that once held theirs. The footprints may have vanished, but the journey, the enduring will to live, to create, to endure still continues in us. In a quiet bend of an ancient river, where the water once flowed slow and heavy with silt, the earth has kept a secret. Beneath its surface, bones lie in still formation, not scattered by time or beasts, but arranged with care. They belong to a vanished kind of humanity, the Neanderthals and the giants who walked beside them. These were not the random remains of hunters lost to nature. They were burials, deliberate and profound. In this silence we hear the earliest whispers of mourning, the first evidence that humans, long before history, understood the meaning of death. The river had been their lifeline. It carried fish, clay, and fresh water through the barren plains. Its banks offered shelter and fertility, its edges shaped by footprints and tools long turned to stone. When the excavations began thousands of years later, archaeologists expected the ordinary debris of survival, tools, hearths, perhaps animal bones. What they uncovered instead was order. Bodies lain in curved rows, hands folded over ribs, ochre powder dusted across skulls. Each gesture suggested intention, a ritual born not of instinct but of remembrance. The placement of these burials tells a story of reverence. Some skeletons were turned toward the river, as if facing the flow of eternity. Others were covered with stone slabs, protecting them from scavengers and from time. The soil around them bore traces of pigments, iron reds, and deep yellows, colors chosen with meaning. Red ochre, in particular, was no mere decoration. Across continents, it has been found wherever early humans buried their dead. Its presence here speaks of symbolism. Perhaps a belief that death was not an end but a passage. The color of life carried into the stillness beyond. Among the remains were the bones of both Neanderthals and larger, more robust humans, evidence that even in death they shared the same ground. Their skulls bore marks of care, cleaned and placed gently. Some had tools beside them, scrapers, blades, fragments of ivory beads. Others had the bones of animals laid nearby, perhaps offerings or companions for the journey to whatever lay beyond. This was not survival, it was meaning. The river became their temple, and burial became their prayer. The discovery of these sites changes the way we see our ancient kin. They were not creatures living only by instinct. They were people who felt loss and carried memory. To bury the dead is to acknowledge absence. It is to love enough to let go. Somewhere in that act of parting, the idea of soul was born, the belief that life was greater than flesh. It is here, beside this forgotten river, that humanity first reached across the veil of mortality and found its reflection in eternity. Over time, the water rose and receded, flooding the graves, burying them beneath layers of silt and sand. Centuries passed, then millennia. When the river finally withdrew, its banks revealed the quiet architecture of care. Each bone was a word, each arrangement a sentence, in the first language of remembrance. Today, standing above that ancient floodplain, it is possible to feel the weight of their gesture. The bones beneath the river are not just remnants of extinction, they are monuments to awareness. They remind us that even in a world ruled by hunger and cold, there existed tenderness. The Neanderthals and the giants knew what it meant to say goodbye. And through their final act, they left behind more than fossils. They left proof that long before civilization, before words and faiths and nations, humanity had already learned to grieve, to honor, and to remember. Deep beneath the earth, where time moves differently and the air tastes of stone and memory, the walls begin to speak. The voices are not made of sound, but of color, shape, and rhythm. They belong to a people who vanished long ago yet refused to let silence claim them. The Neanderthals and the giants, in the twilight of their age, began to carve their stories into the bones of the world itself. Their hands, stained with ochre and ash, pressed against rock, turning memory into symbol. What they left behind would outlast their bodies, their tribes, and their names. In these markings, the swirls, spirals, and towering figures etched into cave walls, human imagination first awakened. The earliest artists were not seeking beauty, they were seeking meaning. In the cold, dark chambers of their world, surrounded by the hum of dripping water and the crackle of torches, they gave form to what they felt but could not yet speak. Animals emerge from the walls: mammoths, bison, and lions, drawn in lines of pigment that seem to move when the fire flickers. Beside them, stranger shapes appear. Towering silhouettes with broad shoulders, their arms spread as if holding up the sky. Archaeologists debate their origins. Some say these were depictions of the giants themselves, immortalized in myth. Others believe they were gods in human form, the first guardians of mountain and storm. In many caves, smaller handprints accompany the colossal figures. The Neanderthals, who lived and worked beside the giants, added their marks like whispers alongside the thunder. Their art was intimate and deliberate. A hand pressed against stone, dusted with ochre, became a declaration of existence. I was here. I lived beneath this sky. Together, these images reveal a relationship between two species that went beyond survival. They dreamed together. They imagined forces larger than themselves. As the world grew colder and food scarcer, the stories on the walls became more spiritual. Patterns of circles and crescents repeat again and again, symbols that scholars now believe represent the moon. Some Neanderthal sites show careful alignments between painted marks and the cycles of light that entered the cave from narrow openings above. It is as if they were charting time, honoring the moon as a guide through the darkness. Legends born from this age speak through imagery. The giants who guarded the mountains, the Neanderthals who followed the moon's silver path. Myth became a form of memory, carrying truth through imagination. Small totems carved from ivory and bone have been found near these painted chambers, faces with deep eyes, figures of animals and humans intertwined. Some stand upright as if placed for worship. Others were buried near hearths or graves. They were not random carvings but sacred objects, the beginnings of story, belief, and symbol. Through them, these ancient humans began to shape the invisible, the concept of spirit, protection, and destiny. Each painting, carving, and figure is an echo, a message left for the future. They tell us that the dawn of myth began not in temples or cities, but in the cold belly of the earth, where fear and wonder lived side by side. The giants who once watched from mountaintops became the first deities, their size turned into legend. The Neanderthals who followed the stars and marked the moon's rhythm became the first storytellers. Even now, when light touches those ancient walls, the figures seem to breathe again. They remind us that before history, before words, humans were already trying to explain the vastness of existence. The echoes in the stone still speak of mountains that once had guardians, of moons that once had keepers, and of a shared dream that would one day become the language of gods and men. The age of the giants ended not with fire or battle, but with silence. It began slowly, so gradually that even the earth itself seemed unaware of what it was losing. The tall ones who had once ruled the northern plateaus, who had hunted mammoths through storms and shaped tools that defied the cold, began to fade. Their fires grew fewer. Their voices, once echoing across valleys of ice and stone, fell quiet beneath the roar of the changing wind. The world they had mastered was shifting beneath their feet, and strength alone could not hold it back. The causes were many, woven together like threads of frost across the tundra. The land had grown tired, its herds scattered and its rivers shallowed by the encroaching glaciers. Food became scarce, and the cycles of plenty that had once sustained great populations broke apart. The giants, bound by their size and the enormous energy their bodies demanded. Each winter took more than the last. Infants failed to survive the cold, and the elders, who had once carried the memory of the hunt, perished without passing on their knowledge. The lineage that had endured for millennia was being unmade, one hungry season at a time. But the decline was not only of body, it was of time itself. The giants reproduced slowly, their generations long, and their numbers few. They had lived with a rhythm measured by the great migrations of the mammoth and the rise and fall of ice. The pace that had once matched the planet's heartbeat now betrayed them. The Neanderthals, more adaptable and quick to change, filled the gaps left behind. The smaller, leaner humans who would one day inherit the earth, expanded across the plains the giants had once ruled. There was no war between them, no conquest, only quiet replacement. The giants receded like the last tide before a new shore. Their remains tell the story with aching clarity. Buried deep in mountain caves and river terraces, their bones are massive yet fragile, bearing the marks of malnutrition and strain. Joints worn from years of labor, teeth cracked from gnawing frozen meat, ribs scarred by disease. The earth holds them gently, as if reluctant to let go. Even their tools, once monumental in size and craftsmanship, grow smaller near the end as if they had begun to use less, to make do with what little remained. Still, they did not vanish in despair. Evidence suggests they endured with dignity, clinging to the rituals that had long defined them. Hearths continued to burn in their last shelters, pigments were still ground into dust, and carvings were made even as their numbers dwindled. They knew the end was near, but they also knew that memory could outlive the flesh. The caves that once rang with their footsteps became their tombs, filled with the faint glow of ochre and the echoes of a fading race. When the last of the giants walked beneath the thinning sky, the earth was already moving toward spring. The ice began to recede, revealing a world that would no longer belong to them. Their fires went dark, their tools buried beneath new soil, and the winds that once carried their scent over the mountains blew clean again. Their twilight was not defeat, it was transformation. They became part of the landscape, part of the myth that would outlive them. The stones they touched, the bones they left, and the stories whispered by those who came after turned them from flesh to legend. And though their bodies have long turned to dust, their memory endures, towering in silence, reminding us that even the mightiest beings are bound by time, and that every age, no matter how powerful, must one day step into the dusk. The wind carried the smell of ash and pine across the empty valley, where a single fire still burned against the coming dark. Around it, the last of the Neanderthals gathered, their shadows flickering along the cave walls. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft crackle of wood. Beyond the mouth of the cave stretched a world they no longer recognized. The rivers had changed their paths, the forests had thinned, and the herds that once thundered across the plains were gone. The Neanderthals had endured for hundreds of thousands of years, through storms, glaciers, and fire. But now, at the edge of their final age, endurance was no longer enough. Archaeologists call this moment the twilight of the Neanderthals, but for those who lived it, it was something quieter, an evening that never ended. The evidence from their last settlements tells the story. Small hearths built from stone, scattered bones of deer and hare, and tools worn smooth from years of reuse. Each layer of ash in those caves marks a night survived, and each night carried the memory of what was fading. Their numbers had fallen so low that they could no longer find one another. Families became fragments, and fragments turned into echoes. The last campfires of their kind burned in southern Europe, where the ice loosened its hold and the winds were gentle enough to allow one more generation to live. In those caves, they left behind traces of art and tenderness, shell beads, stained with ochre, a bird bone pierced to make a pendant, and handprints small enough to belong to a child. These were not acts of survival but of remembrance. Even as the world turned against them, they continued to create, to adorn, to find beauty in the act of being alive. The horizon that once held herds of bison now shimmered with emptiness. The sky, once filled with the cries of birds and the scent of rain, had grown still. They must have sensed the change. The great mammoths moved south, followed by new humans who came with lighter bodies and faster minds. The Neanderthals watched them from afar, knowing that something irreversible was unfolding. Their time was ending not with violence, but with quiet displacement. A slow erasure written by climate, chance, and evolution. In the dim light of that last fire, one can imagine the thoughts that might have passed through their minds. The knowledge of a people who understood the cold better than any who came after. The rhythm of a world they had mastered. The stories told in low voices as sparks drifted into the night, carrying the final embers of a lineage that had walked the earth for over 300,000 years. When the fire finally died, there was no witness to its last glow. The ashes cooled, and the cave filled with the breath of the wind. Yet the traces remained stone tools arranged with care, a circle of soot upon the floor, a bone carving lying beside it. These were the last whispers of a people who refused to disappear without leaving a memory behind. Today, when we uncover those ashes, we are not just studying extinction. We are listening to a farewell. The last Neanderthal campfire was not merely an ending, it was a testament. A declaration that even as the world changed beyond recognition, they remained human to the very end. Creators, mourners, dreamers beneath the dying light. And though their bodies are gone, their fire still burns quietly in us, in the warmth of our hands, in the persistence of our stories, and in the ancient glow that connects us all to the first fires of our kind. The wind has a way of remembering what the earth forgets. It moves through the valleys and cliffs where ancient fires once burned, carrying the faintest echoes of voices long vanished. It touches the stone tools buried in the soil, the hollow of caves where soot still clings to ceilings blackened by flame, and the bones that have turned to stone beneath layers of dust and time. In that wind, something speaks a whisper not of words, but of memory. The Neanderthals and the giants are gone, yet the world still carries the outline of their presence. They are not only fossils in museums or fragments in the ground. They are part of the wind, part of the rhythm of the land that once gave them life. Over thousands of years, their traces were transformed. Bones hardened into fossils, footprints into rock, and stories into myth. The giants who once strode across the frozen plains became the guardians of mountains in later legend, their size exaggerated by memory until they stood as symbols of strength and endurance. The Neanderthals, smaller but no less human, were remembered as spirits of the forests, shadows at the edge of ancient fires, beings both familiar and mysterious. In truth, they were neither monsters nor gods. They were people, our kin, whose lives unfolded in the harsh light of an unforgiving world. Yet time reshaped them into stories, and stories kept them alive. The archaeological record is the quiet testimony of their existence. A chipped flint lies beside a fossilized hearth. A fragment of ochre bears the scrape of a tool once held by steady hands. These remnants are more than artifacts. They are the syllables of a language older than writing, a narrative told in stone and bone. Every discovery is a small resurrection, a moment when silence breaks and the past breathes again. In these fragments, we hear what the wind has been whispering all along, that memory never truly dies, it only changes form. As humans spread across the world, the memory of those who came before traveled with them. Around campfires and under open skies, our ancestors told tales of beings who once shared the earth. In their myths, the giants became mountain dwellers or fallen titans, and the Neanderthals became spirits who guided the moon, protectors of the old forests. These were not inventions of fantasy, but echoes of inherited memory, cultural fossils passed down through generations until they became legend. The stories kept the dead alive in the only way that mattered, by remembering. The wind that moves through the valleys of Europe today still touches the same stones they once held, the same rivers where they drank, the same stars they watched from their shelters. To stand in those places is to feel time collapse. The distance between now and then is measured not in centuries, but in breath. When the air stirs through an ancient cave or rustles the grass above a burial site, it feels as though the world itself is speaking their names, names we no longer know, but which once carried the weight of love, fear, and belonging. They are gone, but their story endures. In every human hand that shapes a tool, in every eye that looks to the stars and wonders where we came from, their legacy remains. The bones beneath the soil remind us of mortality, but the myths born from them remind us of continuity. What began as survival became memory, and memory became meaning. The Neanderthals and the giants were the first to carve that meaning into the earth, and though the wind has carried their voices far beyond hearing, it still speaks their names to anyone who listens closely enough. There are moments when the past feels close enough to touch. In the quiet between breaths, when the wind moves softly through the grass, or the night sky opens wide above us. The echoes of those who came before seem to rise again. We do not see them, yet they are there in the stillness, in the rhythm of the world, in us. The Neanderthals, the giants, the countless early humans whose names were never spoken aloud, they have not vanished completely. Their traces remain within our blood, within our dreams, within the stories we tell when the fire burns low. Every human being alive today carries fragments of that forgotten world. The genes of the Neanderthals, preserved in our DNA, whisper of their endurance, their adaptability, their quiet brilliance. Within our immune systems, in the structure of our bones and the resilience of our minds, pieces of their legacy remain. Science confirms what myth had already intuited, that we are not separate from them, but extensions of their journey. We are the continuation of an ancient flame, passed hand to hand through the dark corridors of time. But the inheritance we carry is more than biological. It is spiritual, emotional, and symbolic. The stories we tell, the myths of giants, the spirits of the mountains, the guardians of fire, are echoes of the beings who once stood beneath the same stars. The instinct to remember, to honor the past, began with them. In the caves they painted, in the bones they buried, in the fires they kindled, they left the blueprint for everything that would follow: art, memory, ritual, meaning. Even now, when we tell stories around our own modern fires, when we look into the embers and imagine the faces of those long gone, we are reenacting something as old as humanity itself. The giants may have fallen to hunger, the Neanderthals to time, but their essence flows within us like an underground river. Every dream of power, every yearning for belonging, every moment of wonder at the night sky, they felt it first. They gave form to awe before words existed, and that gift has never left us. Their world ended, but their awareness endured, and in some quiet way, perhaps they knew it would. Perhaps, as they looked into their last fires, they sensed that life itself was not ending, but changing, that they would live on in a future they could never imagine, through descendants they would never meet. We are the proof of their endurance, the living echo of their song. The same wind that once cooled their faces still moves across our skin. The same stars they watched from their shelters still shine above us, constant and unblinking. When we close our eyes and listen to the rustle of the trees, the hum of the earth, the crackle of the fire, we can almost hear them. The Neanderthals who buried their dead in love, the giants who guarded the frozen plains, all speaking through the language of wind and memory. And so the story returns to silence, not as an ending but as a circle completed. The bones beneath the soil have become the roots of who we are. The myths born from their lives have become the heartbeat of our imagination. They are not gone. They have merely changed form. We walk their earth, breathe their air, and dream their dreams anew. When the night grows still and the wind rises, listen closely, because in that breath between worlds, they are still here, speaking softly, reminding us that we who remember are never truly alone,